Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending, of course, on where you are. Thank you for joining Mayer Brown's Global Financial Markets teleconference series. Today's call is titled, Now is the Time to Act, Understanding the OCC's Initial Climate Change-Related Expectations. My name is Paul Forrester, and I'm pleased to host today's call. I am a partner in Mayer Brown's Chicago office and a member of our corporate and securities practice with a focus on structured credit, including CLOs, as well as energy and project development matters. Before beginning today's presentation, a couple of housekeeping items. As regular GFM listeners know, our calls are recorded, and we will be emailing an audio link to that recording to all participants following today's call, so that if you want to listen to the teleconference again or share it with colleagues, you may certainly do so. In addition, the recording will also be available as a podcast on your podcast preferred platform. We do not have a Q&A format in GFM calls, but we certainly encourage you, if you have questions, to send them to us using the email address gfm@mayerbrown.com, and we will respond as promptly as we are able. By the way, that is the same email address as was included on your invitations to today's call. Joining me today is Matthew Bezants. Matt is a senior associate in our financial services regulatory and enforcement practice in Washington, D.C. Although he won't be an associate much longer, he has been promoted to partner effective January 1st, so congratulations, Matt. Matt counsels U.S. and non-U.S. financial services firms on a variety of regulatory and compliance matters and transactions, as well as investigations and examinations. With that brief introduction, I'm delighted now to begin today's discussion. We've obviously seen from a number of regulatory sources similar moves to start stating expectations. The New York Department of Financial Services issued theirs earlier this year. We've certainly seen similar pronouncements in Europe and from the Bank of International Settlements, but today's call is obviously focused on the OCC's most recent call to action. Matt, would you mind telling us exactly what that call to action is?
Sure, Paul. Thank you. It's interesting that the call to action is actually a speech that the acting comptroller of the currency, Michael Hsu, gave at the OCC headquarters. And so the fact that it was a speech he gave to other OCC staff is sort of indicative of the fact that it's more than just a speech, that it is a forum for him to communicate the agency's expectations to the banks that it regulates. And so while, for those who are familiar with bank regulation, this comes as no surprise, while there is the written law, there's the regulations, the black letter things in the CFR, there's also a host of supervisory expectations that regulators have for the regulated institutions. And these are communicated in a variety of ways through supervisory guidance, through communications with the bank's examiners, on-site type things, and also through messages like this speech. And this speech is a call to action on climate change, and so it's something that's new that, again, we can't point to a regulation and say, well, this is how banks are supposed to manage climate change. And typically, we've seen in other instances things that start off as a high-level speech or similar supervisory expectation have a way of morphing over time to be more formalized and also in some cases to proceed to becoming a regulation or other more binding expectation.
Matt, would you mind telling us who does this technically apply to?
Sure. So the speech, the comptroller, the acting comptroller, indicated that it applies to larger banks. And what that means is larger banks that the OCC regulates. So we're talking about national banks, we're talking about federal savings associations, and federal branches and agencies of foreign banking organizations. And when the OCC says larger can mean different things depending on the setting. And so historically, it's been $50 billion or more. There are some instances where the OCC says $100 billion or more, or $250 billion or more in total assets. But a conservative read would be that by saying larger banks, the comptroller is expressing this as an expectation for banks with $50 billion or more in total assets. However, I should add that isn't the only group that needs to be focused on these expectations. Recently, about last week, the chief counsel for the OCC, their chief lawyer, was giving comments, and he pointed out that community banks, so those with far less than 50 billion, need to think about climate change, and maybe not as formalized as what the comptroller said in his speech, but he talked about things like if they are lending mortgages in a coastal setting, that could be a concern, or if you have a community bank that's doing agricultural-based lending, that he said, well, those all raise climate change concerns, and the OCC would be expecting community banks to manage the risks from climate change. And so that's a good example of how what may start off as an expectation for the largest, most complicated or most sophisticated banks has a way of trickling down through the supervisory process, through best practices, or as examiners are rotated among banks, and has a way of making it its way to smaller banks that are OCC regulated. The other part to think about with who it applies to is, it applies to OCC regulated institutions, but it is the first it's the first game in town as far as the federal regulators are concerned. The Federal Reserve and the FDIC have not released similar expectations for the banks they regulate, and so there is an inclination to say, well, this is what larger Federal Reserve or larger FDIC banks might look to as an approach to managing climate risk, that maybe their examiners aren't asking about it, their examiners don't have the same supervisory expectation, but this approach has the benefit of at least being blessed by one regulator. It's similar to what people would have said last year after NYDFS released its climate change expectations, and it's similar to what people have said about the OCC's heightened standards for general risk management, that by being the first to the table or the only one to the table, that other state-chartered institutions might look to it as an example or a model for the framework that they could consider adopting.
Thanks, Matt. The acting comptroller offered, I think, 5 questions that he thought all regulated institutions should be asking themselves. What were the key themes in those questions?
So the first is I'll say as a preliminary point, is that he views this as a journey that starts really today. And so in responding to these 5 questions, he recognized that institutions may not have all of the answers today. They may need time to develop answers, build systems, collect data. And so this is really a journey that bank boards and their senior management should be starting today, of saying, well, what are the questions we need to be asking? What are the data we need to answer those questions? And what are the controls we need to manage the risks that we find in those answers? And so he's really looking at this as a journey that begins today, and by this time next year, it would appear that banks should have more solid answers, should have an action plan maybe of how they're going to address what they found in their analysis. And so that'll come as the first theme. The second theme is that this isn't a pop quiz, that banks will need to go and develop, say, the equivalent of research answers to these questions, that they will need to build risk management systems or enhance their existing risk management systems to allow them not only to answer these questions, but to manage the climate change-related risks. And so the 5 questions talk about, well, the board should ask management these questions, but also management should go out and develop metrics. They should go out and develop stress testing systems or scenario analysis systems. They should enhance their business continuity plan. So really it's a building these capabilities so that management of the banks can answer the board's questions. The third theme that I'll touch on is that scenario analysis is something that the regulators are increasingly viewing as a key part of climate change risk management. And for those who maybe are new to this to bank regulation, that scenario analysis really came into its own in the 2008 financial crisis, when the Federal Reserve used it to test the capital and solvency of the largest banking organizations. And since then, it has been widely used in testing capital adequacy and liquidity. And what has come out of both the work by the Federal Reserve and by the intergovernmental NGFS is that climate change can also be addressed through scenario analysis. The OCC encourages the larger banks to use scenario analysis to understand climate change related risks. And in particular, it suggests that the scenario analysis should be top-down, which is similar to the type of stress testing that the Federal Reserve might do on capital, but also bottom-up, which is a more ad hoc or iterative stress testing of the bank identifies a particular aspect of the risk, a particular scenario that might be common. We lend in this area of potential flooding. How do we, what's our exposure? And so that type of bottom-up or ad hoc scenario analysis is something the OCC views as being equally informative to the bank's decision-making. The fourth theme is that risk from climate change involves both customers and operations. That we may talk about climate change-related risk as to what customers should we lend to, how should we lend to them, what are products we should offer, or where should we offer them. But it's also looking at the bank's own operations. So things like where are its data centers located? Are they exposed to say, increased hurricane risk? Are they exposed to particular things with the heat waves or other types of risks like that? And looking at risks from service providers, that maybe the bank has a footprint that is low risk, but our service providers' data centers, our service providers' networks in areas that are exposed to climate change risk, and how do we manage that? And so that's both the operational side as well as the risks presented by customer-facing activities. And the final theme I'll touch on, is it's a bit of a positive one after all that doom and gloom, is that the comptroller recognizes there will be opportunities for banks from understanding climate change-related risk. He frames it as if the brakes are better on the car, then we can go faster, and I think that's true. I also think about maybe my own parents when I was a child. They might not want to hear that I was going really fast in the car, even if it had good brakes. And I think that is a something we'll touch on maybe a little bit later, but understanding that just because an opportunity is being managed from a climate change-related point, there may be other reputational or strategic considerations that we'll touch on. But again, I'll come back to that maybe a little bit later.
I think I'm going to ask you to come back to it now. You've touched on a number of points, I think, but all of them might be brought under an umbrella. How should banks actually be thinking about a response to the OCC's expectations?
So I think that there's two ways to think about it. The first is that this isn't like a pop quiz, so we don't need to draft answers and send them to the OCC. That's not what they're looking for to these questions. But what they're looking for is for boards of directors to ask these types of questions of senior management. And so at a basic level, we'd be looking for documentation in the board minutes of there was a discussion on climate change, and we went over it. And it wasn't just a one-time discussion. We asked these questions in January, and the board presented credible challenge, things of questioning management further on certain responses. And so then it was brought up again in March. And in March, we challenged management further on this and asked them to develop data. And so then maybe in a June board meeting, management was able to present some initial data to us showing our risk exposures from certain types of activities. And so that type of iterative process, ideally documented in board minutes and supported by management's own analysis and risk management activities, that is how banks should be responding to these questions.
Very insightful. You've obviously thought a good deal about this. Do you have any views about some of the difficult questions or issues that banks may face as they start to address these expectations?
Sure. Yes. So we've been thinking about that here in the FSRI practice a fair bit, and we have I'll say a punch list, and I won't go through it all, but so some of the ones we've identified is the most basic is data quality, and this was one that the House Republicans flagged recently of that there aren't a lot of good data sets on climate change related risk. That obviously there's lots of great data sets on credit risk. There's There's loss data on operational risk. There's tons of market data for market risk, but there isn't a good data set to say, well, this is the way we quantify, this is the way we talk about, even a taxonomy of, well, what are the types of climate risk? How do we separate weather risk from the risk of greenhouse gases, and where are the boundaries that we draw for the subtypes? And so that, I think, is going to be a problem that a lot of banks face, is that they can't even go out and buy a data set from a vendor. Similarly, there's not a lot of work done around what are the scenarios that the regulators are looking for scenario analysis. There are some scenarios from NGFS, but those are somewhat limited, and again, they would need to be tailored to the bank. And just because someone has experience in crafting capital stress testing or liquidity stress testing, that doesn't necessarily carry over. So there may need to be some enhancement of stress testing procedures to take into account climate change scenario analysis. Another difficulty I think I'll touch on is that there may be policy or I'll say reputational limitations on climate risk management. And so in risk management, when we talk about identifying a risk, we have four common ways to respond to it: of avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept the risk. That those are the four ways to respond to a risk. And so a risk transfer might be something like buying credit insurance or entering into a credit default swap. And so that's how you transfer the credit risk from the bank to someone else. And that might not work for some things in climate change, that it may be unacceptable to say, oh, well, we're going to make a loan that increases our climate risk and then transfer it in a certain way. That might not be palatable in certain circumstances. And so we may need to consider is risk avoidance or risk mitigation something that are more preferable strategies. I don't know the answers, but these are conversations that boards should be having with management about how do we need to change our risk responses. Another similar aspect of the reputational risk management is that just because something will manage climate risk may not make it acceptable. That there's in Texas there are certain laws requiring that cut off banks from servicing governments unless the banks provide services to certain other customers. There was the proposed OCC Fair Access rule last year that would have required banks to provide services in the energy sectors regardless of things like climate change. And so trying to manage those demands of, well, we may want to take this action, or it may even be profitable to take this action, but there are public relations consequences, or there are legal obligations that prevent us from doing so. That's going to be a change that again, banks haven't really had to confront in some of the other risk management sectors.
You've described this as a journey. Are there deadlines or timelines in the call to action?
So there are not. For those who may remember it, that the way heightened standards worked for general risk management is the OCC first started introducing it to the largest banks in 2010, 2011. It kind of gained some public notice in 2012, and then it became a binding requirement in 2015. It sounds like the timeline for these climate risk management standards will be more accelerated. That the comptroller has said that he expects the larger bank boards to begin addressing these questions now and to have better answers within a year. So we're talking about that the OCC is expecting pretty good work within a year, and that kind of means that systems will need to be put in place over that year. And banks will need to have at least an action plan, I would expect, in place within that year to show progress and to show that they are taking this seriously.
Thanks again, Matt. I guess what else will we see from the OCC? You mentioned the morphing from expectation to regulation. Is that at issue and contemplated here, or is there more work or other issuances that we should be looking down the road for?
Sure. So we don't have a clear sense of whether it'll make it into regulation, but the comptroller has said that later this year or early next year, the OCC will issue a framework for managing climate risk. This sounds similar to the framework it issued in 2014 for managing general risk. We have recent frameworks for credit risk review. So it'll probably be some type of document, maybe 10 to 25 pages, outlining the framework for managing climate risk. And this will be the broad thematic document that banks should be looking to when they are designing those systems over the next year. The comptroller has also said that his agency will be issuing more detailed guidance throughout 2022. It's unclear exactly what this guidance will be, but it seems likely that it'll address some of the themes from the 5 questions. So things like business continuity, vendor management, scenario analysis, and also maybe some of the things around individual risk stripes. So again, it can be pretty clear how climate change affects credit and operational risk, but maybe talking about things like how it affects compliance risk or strategic risk, that we might see some pronouncements on specific risk stripes next year.
Very interesting. Moody's, of course, estimated recently there's $22 trillion of potential climate risk assets held in financial institutions around the world. How is the OCC expectations going to be aligned or harmonized with what other U.S. regulators are doing and what obviously their counterparts in Europe and Asia and elsewhere are doing?
Hopefully they will be well aligned, and hopefully there will be an opportunity for public engagement to make sure it is well aligned. I think we internally have looked informally benchmarked the OCC against the ECB's framework, and there are some strong themes that tie it together. The ECB's is 13 elements. We don't know exactly how the OCC will define it, but the themes are the same of I think they call it sensitivity analysis in ECB, and it's more scenario analysis in the OCC world. So we have some strong themes. I think that banks will need to recognize, though, that there may not be perfect alignment. So even between the OCC and the Federal Reserve, there's been a lack of alignment on general risk management framework, and that's been around since 2014, 2016. That the OCC and the Fed use slightly different approaches, and there are ways that an institution can try to rationalize them. But I wouldn't expect perfect alignment, particularly within a large financial group that, again, has exposure to European regulators, might have exposure to securities regulators, that it will take a fair bit of thought of what are our most important regulators, what are their most important concerns within their framework, and how do we make this into a good enterprise risk management system. So it may be that the regulators never align, but institutions find a way to align their activities and their risk management practices to the various expectations.
Matt, you've given us a lot to think about. I think we're going to have you back, albeit as a partner next year, to help us with some of these further developments that the OCC is thinking about. That concludes our presentation today. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Just a couple of quick reminders. Keep an eye out for the email with the link to the recording of today's call, and the recording also will be available as a podcast. And as I mentioned, if you have questions regarding today's subject matter, please send them by email to gfm@mayerbrown.com. With that, we're going to close today's presentation. Thank you again for your participation. You may all now disconnect.